thank you very much for taking the time, and welcome. Thanks for being here. Thank you, SAP, for hosting us. Very excited to have the opportunity. I love this building. I love being in this manufacturing facility. It's like a factory feeling. I feel like we're manufacturing innovation. In fact, I don't even have any notes here. I just have a picture of a duck. So I'm really here to tell stories because I feel like that's what's engaging. Okay, they're a little technical, these stories. They're a little technical, but I think you guys can handle that. So this is my first time at the summit, actually. And at the beginning of this event, they asked for a show of hands, and I was one of those people that put up my hand to say it was my first time here. So who am I? My name is Steve Oken. When I made my business card on the Ducky page, there was a picture of a CN Tower because I'm from Toronto in Canada, and there was a picture of a palm tree because when I joined Corey-LM, I actually moved to our home office location in Clearwater, Florida. There was a picture of a guitar as well because I love music. But when it comes to business, what I've always been interested in, I started in technology, but I was very interested in business, and business transformations came to me pretty early in my career, fortunately for me, because I found that very interesting. I was working for a bookstore chain up in Canada, and we were a 14-store company. We had just acquired a very large competitor with 300 stores because we had a very wealthy owner, and they wanted to reinvent the way we did business. So I found myself first going through a selection process of, what's the best software to do this? Of course, we picked SAP because it was the best. And then I led that implementation, and it was very successful. So I learned a lot about retail at the time. I learned a lot about SAP, about business transformations, and I kind of got the bug. And I got stuck into that in a lot of different ways. First as a customer, and then eventually as an independent consultant, and then ultimately as a leader of a team of up to 300 people guiding transformations. My first introduction to Corey-LM was actually as a customer. So I was a customer because I was leading a team of people that were implementing business transformations. And we hired Corey-LM and used their software for our customers to get customer success. So that was my first exposure. I'll come back and I'll talk about some of those stories, actually. Let's talk a little bit. Many of you already know who Corey-LM is, but let me give you a quick overview from my perspective. So Corey-LM was started over 12 years ago. It was founded by Labinat Bitucci, our CEO and founder. Just before launching Corey-LM, Labinat had a role at SAP. I think he had various titles there, but one of his most recent titles and important title for this room was that he was an ALM and Solution Manager Global Practice Lead for about 6 years in that kind of range. And 12 years ago, he decided to leave SAP and launch Corey-LM. As you can see, since that time, from the small selection of logos that we have at the bottom of the page here, that we've been successful in implementing Solution Manager for some of SAP's biggest customers. And we've enjoyed success there. But we've noticed that when customers that are very large, who run SAP and have an ALM process that they want to continue to improve, that they have other applications, not just SAP. And that a lot of those times, those applications, the people that manage those applications use different ALM tools. Tools such as Jira, ServiceNow, Azure DevOps. And it's not always that effective to have those people using SAP tools to manage those applications. And so the company in 2018 decided that we would focus on building connectors to help to integrate the whole ALM process so that you could manage SAP and non-SAP applications more effectively. That was pretty early on. in that regard. But so that's a little bit about our history. I come to a lot of these types of presentations, and often when I'm sitting there in your seats, I have questions in my mind. It's usually 3 questions that come to mind. And I want to try to tackle these for you today. Hopefully I can answer them all. The first question is, why listen? Why am I here? Well, you're here, so thank you. You're listening. Hopefully you're paying attention. It looks like it. The second question, we're going to come back and answer these. The second question is really, maybe I get past listening, but why care? Like, why is this important to me? And then, not always do I get past the why care. It really depends. Maybe the presenter has a topic that's of interest to me, and if we're lucky, I may get to the question of why change. So what does that mean? Why change? Well, if we're really going to learn something, there's no way to take advantage of that opportunity if we don't change something that we're doing today. And so I'm not asking you to, go and change everything you do. Sometimes it could be a small change, like doing some research on a new subject, or sometimes it could be a much bigger change, changing the way you do business. That's up to you to decide, but that's really the question is there something here that makes you want to rethink or change something about what you do? And let's look at that. Okay, let's go back to the first question, why listen? So usually people want to listen to something because they have a problem that they want to solve. Okay, so let's talk about problems. In a holistic ALM process, there's different components. There's implementation, which usually involves big projects, design, build, test, release. And then you have operations. Operations, detect, correct, release, all those different areas. So let's look at some problems for each of those 2 different sides. So on the implementation side, and these aren't my problems. I mean, we've all experienced these types of problems before, maybe. But these are the things that we hear from customers. So one of the questions that I get all the time is, hey, Steve, we're an agile company. Why is it that we can't run agile for SAP projects? Okay, so maybe that sounds familiar. Another question is, how can I plan work for teams that are working on totally different timelines? And I'll come back, we're going to talk about this one. And another, how do I prevent SAP integration defects from causing delays in my project timeline? And those are costly delays. All right, so that's implementation type questions. Operational type questions, we hear things like, why can't I have one consistent workflow to manage changes for all my SAP and non-SAP applications? Another question, why can't I use one set of tools to monitor issues coming from all of my applications, whether they're SAP or non-SAP? So those are some questions that we get. And so when it goes back to the why listen question, well, I hope that these questions resonate with you enough that you're at least curious. And so I would just say this, if you're not at least curious, you can get up and leave the room because I'm going to waste the rest of your time for this presentation. So if you're curious, great. Thanks. We'll go to the next question of, okay, so why care? Like, why do I have to care? What is it that makes me want to care? Well, usually it's because I believe that there might be a solution to that problem that I have. And that's, I'm curious because of that. Okay, so let's talk about solutions. And I'm going to quickly go through what Core ALM does. Many of you know us. I'm not going to belabor this point. But we only focus on SAP. So it's always got something to do with SAP Solution Manager or SAP Cloud ALM. We provide services, doesn't matter, operations, implementation, we go across. There's everything you need from a services perspective, we can do that. We have expert consultants who have done this over and over again. We have connectors, as I mentioned, for Jira, Azure DevOps, ServiceNow. And for some people, they like to be able to visualize the status of their business transformation. And so we provide a dashboard. It's like a Scrum board for an agile view of where they are in their business transformation. And to be honest, we do product development and we use our Agile Scrum board to manage all of that as well. And we find it indispensable. Some of our customers just love that, okay? But let's bring this to life with some real customer stories. Like I said, I'm going to tell stories. So this story actually goes back to a time before I joined CoreLM. And I was in a situation where a very large company came to me, and they asked us if we would come and do an assessment of a project that they were running. They were running an Agile SAP implementation project. And they basically asked me, they said, we're running this project, we're doing it Agile. I said, well, you're finished, you're supposed to be finishing your design, but you've kind of already started building. And they said, yeah, well, it's Agile. And I said, I don't think that's going to go well for you. I said, if you go down this path, you're likely going to have delays in your timeline. And if you're doing that during an SAP project, you probably have a lot of people that you're paying for during that time. And you're probably going to find that you're going to go way over budget, and you won't be able to control the situation. And so you probably need a more robust methodology, something like SAP Activate. And they said, thank you very much. And I didn't hear from them for 6 months. And then they called us back and said, so Steve, we'd like you to come in and see if you can help us to take this project in a different direction, which we did. And at that point, that's when I hired CoreLM to come in and help me with this, because we wanted to implement Solution Manager. We wanted to use the best practices for ALM. And so the next question they asked very early on in the time frame, they said, okay, we're not going to run full Agile the way you think about Agile for the SAP, because we learned our lesson there the hard way. But we definitely have teams that use Agile internally. And every single one of those teams, they're used to doing that. We're not going to ask them to change the way they do their business. So how can we keep them in sync with what's going on the project? And that was a tricky question, actually. So let me just paint a bit of a picture on what that could look like. So Agile teams tend to run in 2-week sprints. There's variations, but 2-week sprints is pretty common. So here's a timeline that shows 10 sprints, so that's a 20-week period, okay? Next, we've got the SAP team that usually runs in, sometimes 4 or 5-week sprints. There's not going to be very much that you can do within SAP that's meaningful in a 2-week period. It's just not going to be able to do very much. And then if you add testing, promotion to QA, all that stuff, and then planning for the next sprint, you're not going to get very far in 2 weeks, so they generally run longer cycles. Let's call it 5 weeks. So this creates a bit of a problem. You see, we got 4 sprints going across the top, and you got 10 sprints going behind, but at some point, they got to come together to do integration testing. So how are you going to do that? So what we did in this particular case was we said, okay, we're going to take every single interface between an SAP and a non-SAP application, and we're going to set a milestone date. We took into consideration all the dependencies and all of that stuff in terms of their business process. We set those initial milestone dates. And that way, at least, everybody had a target. They would know, okay, that's the date that we need to be done. So the latest possible sprint became clear as to which one they needed to complete their work so that we would be ready for integration testing. So in this case, the date shows that we'll be done. We're going to do integration testing during sprint 2 for the SAP team and during sprint 4 for the Agile team. So that means they have to do their work before that so that we're ready to go. And so we set those plans. We loaded everything into the respective tools. So all the SAP information was stored in Focus Build, and all the Agile teams were storing their information in Jira. Remember, they're not going to change their Jira tools because that's the way they operate. So that's great, and we could take all that data, we could load it in there, and we could hope that nothing changes, but we know in reality that that's not the way things work. You always have to move internal milestones in order to be able to achieve the end goal at times during these projects. So how are we going to keep everything up to date and in sync? So that's where we brought in our Jira connector. So the Jira connector allowed us to take all the information that was in Focus Build and synchronize it to Jira, and the other way around. So Jira information would flow directly back into Focus Build in real time. Anytime somebody made a change, The update was right there. Everybody could look at the entire program, and they could see exactly where we stood. They used the Agile Scrum board as well, and that way they could actually have a visualization across the entire project of where we stood at any given time. Okay, so that was the solution there. Kind of simple solutions. The tools only can get you so far. It's about how you use it as well. So they definitely used our services. We had solution manager experts there. We also had Scrum Masters who were helping to coordinate the integration of all of those, Scrum activities. And they used the Focus Build connector for Jira, and they used the Scrum board for Focus Build. Okay, so that's first story. Okay, let's take the next story. This is a very large global IT company. They had an interesting situation because they actually had a deadline by which they had to get out of their old system and into S4. So they were doing a greenfield S4 business transformation project, and they had a deadline, hard deadline, and very, very, very large scope. They had some interesting challenges. One of the things that they came to us to say is, look, our testers don't really understand which features, or you could call it requirements or user stories, which features it is that they need to validate. They've got a whole bunch of test cases, and they have to write those test cases. They've got titles, but they need to correlate those back to the actual requirements coming from the business. And so they had a very good system for keeping track of the features in Azure DevOps. They had a change management process, and that's how they controlled scope. So it was very important that they kept it there and maintained that system. But the test cases were stored in Focus Build. Okay, so how are we going to keep all that information in sync? The first thing that we had to look at is, let's make a mapping. This was a one-time exercise. It had to be done. Took some effort. Rolled up our sleeves and basically said, how do those test cases map to those features so that you could actually, the testers could understand, and then everybody downstream would understand how those test cases related. And that mapping information was entered into both tools so that they could have a cross-reference with each other. And then again, we used the Focus Build connector for Azure DevOps to keep everything in sync. So if there was any change to the set of features that we needed to test, then we could understand right away what the impact was to the test case and what test cases need to be rerun, rewritten. And as you're getting test results, we could correlate it back to which features are now good to go, that we can start actually validating those features from an end user perspective. So that's how we were able to, thread the needle in that case. So solutions that were deployed, they used our services. We helped with the testing. We helped with Solution Manager, support, implementation, data loads, all of that, and release management as well. And then, of course, they used the Focus Build connector for Azure DevOps. Okay? All right, I could go on with these stories all day. I love talking about customer challenges. Last one. This is a food manufacturing company, and they were implementing S/4HANA. They didn't actually have a process for managing their changes. Not only SAP changes, but changes across the enterprise. They had more manual approval type processes. And so the company went and did a search, and they decided, okay, we're going to pick ServiceNow. They made a decision that ServiceNow was a tool that they wanted to use to control changes to their environment. And so while they're doing this SAP implementation, they were using Focus Build for that, which we helped them to implement. But they had this ServiceNow thing for post-go live. They need to switch to operating mode, and ServiceNow was going to control things from that point going on. And so what does that look like? So inside of ServiceNow, there's the standard workflow, and they may have made some modifications to their standard workflow in ServiceNow. It doesn't matter because our process here is very configurable, but they had a ServiceNow workflow that they wanted to follow, not just for SAP, but for all their applications. But they also wanted to use Charm to manage those SAP changes. And of course, Charm has its own workflow. So how do you put these two things together and have it so that you don't accidentally release changes that really haven't crossed all the gates, that don't have all the information? Or how do you ensure that you have all the documentation associated with testing, records, results, approvals, and all those things in one location so the auditors can come in and make sure that you have access to all the right information? So the first thing we did is we said, okay, let's create one consolidated workflow that kind of weaves between the two different systems. We went just a paper study like this first, just PowerPoint, and figured out what the flow of steps needs to be. And so the idea was that at some point, when you get to a place in the ServiceNow workflow where it's time to do some work inside of SAP, then you just pass the ball over to Charm, and you let the Charm process continue until it gets to a certain place, and then you're ready to go back for the next round of approval in ServiceNow. And the ball just keeps going back and forth, but you can't move the ServiceNow ticket forward until SAP's done its steps and vice versa, okay? So that's the new rule, which is great, but how do you enforce that? So that's really the definition of what our Charm connector for ServiceNow does for our customers. And it's highly configurable, so that you can set the process to work the way you want to and to prevent changes from progressing before they're ready to go. Okay, so what solutions did we deploy? We definitely used services. Okay, this was a big job because we were implementing SAP with Focus Build, and on the implementation side, in the meantime, we're also designing the post-go live operational release process for ServiceNow and the integration with Charm. And they successfully went live, and they're using that process to release changes to their environment today. Now they're actually talking to us about next step of an N+1 environment. So different story, different time. Okay, so they also, of course, they use the Charm connector for ServiceNow to bring all of this to fruition. Okay, so we've talked about a lot of stories. I just want to quickly summarize, and I have some new announcements in terms of products that we are introducing today, because I've talked mostly about Solution Manager. We are doing some interesting work that I want to highlight, and we have some new products that I'd love to be able to share with you, introduce. So this is a standard sort of look of what we talked about before, implementation, design, just so you can see coverage of what those tools allow you to do. So first, let's focus on Solution Manager and the connectors for Solution Manager. Okay, so first, let's look at Jira. So Jira has full coverage of all of what you need from an implementation perspective, whether it's design, build, test, release management. We do the whole thing. On the operations side, we have the ITSM event notification capabilities, as well as the ability to actually manage releases inside of Charm for changes from Jira directly, which some of our customers find that much more convenient to do it that way. On the Azure DevOps side, pretty much the same footprint. The only gap, and it's really just because we haven't had a customer that was interested in doing the ITSM stuff for Azure DevOps. I'm sure it'll happen one day. And then for ServiceNow, most of our customers really use ServiceNow on the operational side of things, and that's really to cover event notifications and management, like ITSM type events, as well as managing the release, as I described in the last scenario for Charm. And then we also have, as I talked about, that visualization of where you are in your business transformation, the Agile Scrum Board for Focus Build. Okay, but what's new? We're Focus Build, as you've been hearing about. It's time to move on. All right, so I'm excited to talk about where we are from a Cloud ALM perspective. So the first thing is that we have support today, which is new, from Jira, with Jira, I should say. So on the implementation side, you can take Jira and do the same type of integration that you've done in the past with us for Focus Build. Now that's available for Jira, and we are implementing that right now with the customer, and that's going very well so far. We also have the ability to get those kinds of Cloud ALM events loaded up into Jira as, on the Jira services side of things. On the Azure DevOps side, we have also support for the same, your tasks and all of your project management stuff, as well as managing the release directly from Azure DevOps. So that would be moving the features through the landscapes. And then on ServiceNow, at this stage, we have the ability to detect those events coming in from the Cloud ALM connector. We've also taken the tool that most people like to use to visualize where they are on their transformations, and we've ported it over to Cloud ALM. So that will continue to grow and flourish, but certainly we're excited about that. And for anybody that really wants to learn how this can work and how this could be useful to you, but you're not really sure you want to commit, one exciting announcement is we are announcing a free version, a free tier for Solution Manager Focus Build add-on. So really, it's free. You just basically take the software, you're going to upload it to your Solution Manager instance, and away you go. There are some limitations in terms of what you can do, but it's pretty full-featured, and you can manage your work items, work packages, and then you learn and decide if there's something more that you want to do there. So that's really what I wanted to share. Again, thanks very much for giving me the opportunity, for giving me your attention. But let's come back and say, okay, maybe we checked the box. You were curious enough to stay. Thank you for that. Let's see how we did on the why care. I hope with all these problems and possible solutions, maybe you're at the point of interested. And after that, the big question is, why change? And so what is it that makes us consider a change in the way that we do things? I've sort of tended to sign up for some pretty big projects, and when I do that, generally what drives me is the cost of failure being too high. And so when you do these types of projects, you're really putting yourself on the line. We know how challenging it is to do what it is that you do, and we understand. And so if you're in that boat, hopefully you're motivated to investigate solutions. You don't have to become a customer. We're happy to have a conversation. We like hearing about problems. We like sharing our knowledge. We like to learn, and we like to solve puzzles. And so I would encourage you to reach out. It doesn't have to be, you want to buy a product or a service. We just like to hear from you and share ideas, be part of the community, and thank you very much for taking the time, listening to my stories, and wish you all the best for the rest of the summit.